And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're talking to Nick Redfern about his book, The NASA Conspiracies. Nick, at the beginning of the show, we were talking about the History, Haunts, and Legends Conference, which is tomorrow, and I gave out absolutely no information about it. So I figured I'd give it another little plug here now that we're back at the top of the hour. Oh, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. Nick and I are both going to be at the History, Haunts, and Legends Conference, which is being held in Jefferson, Texas, the most haunted city in Texas. Trust me, it is like totally Spooksville, USA. There's speakers all day. There's a ghost walk. There's ghost hunting happening. For more information, go to www.jeffersonghostwalk.com, or you can call Jody, who's hosting the show, if you want to get a ticket at 903-665-6289. That's 903-665-6289. Tell her you heard about it on Just Energy Radio. I'm sure she'd be thrilled. Okay, Nick. Now let's get to the really juicy part. I mean, the other part was juicy, but this is really juicy to me. Let's talk about, pick one. I think I want to go to Faces on Mars.
Okay. Well, yeah, Faces on Mars, I guess, is, sort of the next biggest issue that everybody talks about when it comes to NASA and conspiracies after the moon landings. I think everybody has heard of the so-called Face on Mars, and it's called the Face
Nick,
on Mars.
Before you go on, I have to tell you, when that picture came out on Time magazine, I think it was on the cover, my jaw dropped. I was just shocked because it just seemed so real. I still remember my amazement at seeing it, and that was a long time ago. Okay, I'm zipping.
No, that's fine. No, I mean that's precisely the reason why a lot of people follow this story, because it does have a sort of profound effect on people when they see the face. There's no doubt about that at all. But the story itself of the Face on Mars goes goes back to July 1976, when NASA's Viking 1 space probe was orbiting Mars at the time, and it was securing photographs of the Martian surface. And one of the photographs that came back and that was declassified shows this, what looks like a huge face staring up from the surface of Mars. Now, NASA publicly doesn't avoid talking about the face on Mars at all. It's not like they say, go away, this is a classified matter. Their view is that, although it looks like a face, they take the approach, publicly at least, that it's kind of like people seeing faces in clouds. That's their belief publicly, that when the shadows and the sun's in the right place and it hits certain rock formations, it looks like a face. Now, that's sort of the prevailing position of NASA and of people in the sort of skeptical community who've addressed the Face on Mars controversy. However, which is what I've done, if you speak to the key players in this area, look at their analysis of the photographs, and weigh up the evidence, my personal belief is that the Face on Mars is artificial. I don't believe it's just a straightforward natural rock formation. Now, the big questions are, of course, who built it, when was it built, and why was it built? Most researchers that have looked into the Face on Mars controversy aren't talking about, having been built maybe 5,000, 10,000 years ago. We could be talking 100,000 years ago, 250,000 years ago, because clearly the Martian atmosphere and the terrain today, there is evidence that Mars isn't a dead world. Just to sort of, before I get to the main point, for example, at its north and south poles, there's a lot of frozen water. Now, of course, water is vital to life. There's also indications on some photographs which looks like what could be running water on Mars. And there are even photographs of what look like trees. They become known as banyan trees. If you type into Google banyan tree plus Mars, you'll find the story and the photographs. And these do look like very strange vegetation on the surface of Mars. So it's not impossible that life does exist on Mars to some degree to this day. However, if there were people or an advanced civilization that built the face countless thousands of years ago, that we would see massive evidence of them today, I think. So, and the atmosphere, is very, very different to anything that could support life like us. So, in other words, the likelihood is that there must have been some sort of huge cataclysmic disaster on Mars that destroyed its original atmosphere, that degraded the biosphere to the point where, the people and the oceans and the land, just died or was extinguished. Whether it's something like a war, a nuclear war, or a planetary disaster like a huge meteorite slamming into Mars that, affected its orbit or the atmosphere, or both even. So in other words, you could argue that if this occurred 500,000 years ago and most of the planet was wiped out, the things that would likely survive would be those that, are highly sturdy. And most people who've looked at the face on Mars have concluded that although it's artificial, it is carved out of a natural mesa. So in other words, we're seeing like massive mega-scale engineering to, sort of change a natural formation into something else. Kind of like the sculptures that we have of the four presidents. They're carved out of natural formation, but if anything disastrous happened, they could likely survive, and people would see them centuries later. And that appears to be the case with the face on Mars. Now, the interesting or the more significant points are, why does the face look so human? Does that mean that the people who built it actually look just like us? And if that is the case, is there a connection with the human race? The suggestion's been put forward that if Mars, there was this massive disaster in its past that pretty much destroyed its environment and civilization, maybe the people who lived there had advance warning it was going to happen, and kind of like an armada of them came to the Earth, and the fact that they were so close to us, and looked like us maybe, perhaps this has led to some of the legends of things like the gods coming down from the skies, and there's also the fact that the face looks very much like the Egyptian Sphinx. And if you look at some of the additional photographs that have come back from the area of Mars called Cydonia, which is just north of Mars's equator, where the face is found, you actually see very pyramid-like formations very close to the face. So in other words, you have a Sphinx-like face and pyramid-type structures on Mars, and of course we have the Sphinx and the pyramid in Egypt. And so, people speculate, did the Martians actually come here? Did they help kind of kickstart some of our early civilizations and introduce some of their cultural designs and motifs like pyramids and sphinxes into our cultures? So in other words, there's a lot at stake with respect to the face on Mars and what it might mean, what it might imply, and what it might also mean for our history, have we got our entire history wrong, and that the face could somehow be tied in with it.
Have they ever tried to send one of the Mars rovers over to that area?
No, not specifically to that area, no. But, I mean, the best we have right now are photographs. Now, of course, the big question is, why have we not really... I mean, there have been photographs taken, for example, in the late 1990s. But the problem is, I think the only thing that's going to settle this issue is a manned mission to Mars. I think that will be the one thing more than anything else. But when and if that happens, that's the big question. And of course, depending where you landed on the surface as well, when you're actually on the face, which is huge, it'd be kind of difficult to ascertain if you are seeing something carved. I think it would actually, take a lot of effort to sort of dig into it and, examine the area and try and determine if it has been carved with machine tools, etc., which I personally believe it was. So I think, that the problem is right now we can't go there. We've got photographs and nothing else at all. That is the sort of stark, unfortunate reality. And until that changes, I think the argument is just going to be based around photo analysis. One person's going to say this, somebody else is going to say that. Until we can get past the issue of just having photographs, I think it's going to be an ongoing controversy.
And I've seen some photographs where I don't want to say they photoshopped it, but they've enhanced it, changed the lighting or something, and there actually looks like there's an eyeball with a pupil. I mean, it really looks like a face with more detail than the original photos that were taken in the 70s.
Well, some of the photographs, you actually do see what looks actually like an eye and a pupil and an iris, and these are in the NASA photographs. So, in other words, that's an incredibly important issue. It's kind of like very subtle in terms of what the images actually show, and I think this is why it's important to stress these issues. Now, in 1998, NASA's Mars Global Surveyor took extra photographs of the face of Mars, which convinced a lot of people that it was just a natural formation because it didn't look as clear as the earlier ones. A lot of people don't realize that what NASA actually did was they subjected the image to what's called a high-pass filter, which actually enhances the vagueness of the photograph rather than makes it clearer and more delineated. So, this is sort of a bizarre issue as well. So, in other words, as I said, the problem is photographs are all we have. Unless, as some people believe there is kind of like a secret space program, like a clandestine one running alongside the real one, or the publicly acknowledged one, and maybe in some capacity a military mission may have gone there and checked it all out. It sounds far-fetched and bizarre, but I mean we just don't know. But there are a lot of people who do believe that there is like a secret space program running along tandem, if you like, with the public one.
I know. I heard that we're going to the moon and we're going to Mars, and there's all this activity going on that nobody knows about.
Yeah.
Which is kind of weird. On YouTube, I'm just going to put this out there. On YouTube, there are all kinds of videos, and I want to talk about the moon separate. I want to just stay on Mars for right now, but there's all kinds of videos about Mars anomalies that are out there. Any commentary on there? And let me just add this piece. There's one in particular that has the appearance, I think this is one of my favorites, of there's a mountainside, and carved into the mountain looks like an Egyptian sculpture, like you would expect that Ramses would have made somewhere in Egypt if there was a mountain. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is an important issue. When everybody thinks about the face on Mars, the first response, if you like, when you talk about anomalies, is the fact that people talk about the face on Mars. And I think that's important because it demonstrates that within our popular culture, the face has achieved a tremendous position. But people assume that that's the only anomaly. It actually isn't. I mentioned, for example, you have these things that have become known as banyan trees. If you type in BANYAN and you look at these photographs, they look for all the world like very strange looking, but vegetation. Now you would imagine, that's precisely what they would look like. If it was sort of an extraterrestrial vegetation, it would look as strange as an alien being would look. So I think this is an important issue, that where you have life, then potentially, it allows at some point in Mars' history or present for intelligent life to exist. As I said, if the face simply stood alone and there was nothing else around that, then that could be an argument that some people would make that, well, it's just, it just looks like a face. But when you find these pyramid-type formations, which when you see the photographs of them, in all honesty, they do not look like the effects of wind damage, which is what NASA have said, like natural erosion of like a hill or whatever. They look like sort of carved pyramids. And the fact that they're near the face, this, as I said, inevitably brings forward all these other stories. So I think the fact that we have many anomalies on Mars, we might be surprised at the extent that life exists. I know people have remote viewed Mars, and some of the reports that have come back have talked about people sort of psychically seeing deep underground, highly advanced Martians, in kind of like subterranean enclosures, still managing to survive, and I won't necessarily say thrive, but, against all odds in a planet facing upheaval or whatever, they've managed to hunker down deep underground and continue their civilization to a degree, which sounds highly controversial. But, I think remote viewing, to me, is a genuine and a valid resource tool. And when you hear people talking about these stories on Mars, I don't think we should ignore them. So I think, we could be in for some real surprises, if we actually really do find out what's going on Mars.
When they were having issues with the rovers actually landing, because there were several that never made it, my first inclination, and this is just kind of weird because this is before all the anomaly stuff hit YouTube and everything, my first inclination was, I wonder if they're being blown out of space because they don't want them to land, because they don't want them to find whoever's there, which is kind of a weird thought.
No, you're right. I mean, this is actually a very interesting area. The fact that, when we looked at some of these missions, the Russians had problems as well with, with their probes, etc., vanishing or malfunctioning or just, disappearing. There was, when this began happening sort of several times, I mean, it inevitably sort of gave rise to the notion that, is somebody sabotaging these missions when they get to Mars? Is somebody on the planet itself, ensuring that these probes are shut down? You could argue if somebody was sending probes to the Earth, we might do exactly the same thing. Or it's kind of like having a no-fly zone. There's places you don't fly over, and if you do, you risk getting blasted out of the sky. And, that was one of the theories that was put forward, that it seemed almost too coincidental that some of these craft would arrive only to malfunction at the very last stage, just when they're at the most important point in the program.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've seen any of this or investigated this at all. I just became aware of these claims about anomalies on Saturn, or maybe one of Saturn's moons. Have you heard anything about that?
Well, I mean, there have been stories for a long time about Saturn's moon Titan, because Titan does have an atmosphere. And there have actually been various people tied to NASA who claimed insider knowledge of UFOs supposedly coming from Titan. NASA's taken a big interest in Titan due to the fact that, as I said, it does have a viable atmosphere. It's certainly not Earth-based, but where you have an atmosphere, again, you have the potential for life. So, in other words, I don't know so much about anomalies on Titan, but I do know, it has been suggested as a viable place where there could be some sort of life.
Just thinking about it makes me cold. Okay, let's come back more closer to Earth. I want to talk about the censored photos, but let's talk about some of the anomalies. Somebody had raised a question about, in the chat room, about space junk, and then there is also the conspiracy that there are actually structures on the moon.
Yeah, I mean, the story about structures on the moon is a very interesting one. A number of people have talked about, seeing like installations and even mining activity and things like that. And one of the more intriguing stories I talk about in the book involved a man named Carl Wolf. Carl Wolf was in the U.S. Air Force in the 1960s and had a top-secret clearance. And he's actually gone on record and spoken quite openly, and his background's been verified, so he's a very credible person. But he went on record, I think initially about 10 years ago, and he told this very interesting story about how in midway through 1965 he was assigned to a program at Langley Air Force Base, Virginia, that was connected with NASA's lunar orbiter, and he got speaking with a fellow airman there who. It was pretty clear to Carl Wolf almost immediately that the airman was deeply worried about something very, very big. And the airman finally confided in Carl Wolf that during the course of its analysis of various photographs taken of the moon, NASA had apparently uncovered evidence of a large base of unknown origin on its far side. Now, people may not realize that although the moon, orbits the Earth, whereas our planet is continually rotating, the moon always keeps its same face towards the Earth. It doesn't spin around, so we see all the faces of the moon as it's going around the Earth. We just see the one face all the time. So in other words, it has this far side that we don't see. And reportedly, this was where these images had been taken from that Carl Wolf was told about. And the airman told him that, they weren't rock formations. It actually looked like huge structures that essentially made it sound like some sort of sprawling space installation or space city, rather than, we weren't talking about like the equivalent of like a North Pole outpost, that would be home to like 15 or 20 people or whatever. We're talking about something that was literally described as being like a huge city-type formation. So, I think in that respect, when we hear stories like this from very credible military people, I think the onus is on us that, we have to sort of look into them further.
And I'm looking at the time because I'm going, do I want to go here yet? We have, it's not about yet. I'm going, we have like 4 minutes till the music comes back up for the next commercial break. And I know. So it would be on the dark side where these supposed moon bases are. Actually, different question. Is that why NASA, or there are rumors that say that that's why we don't go back to the moon, because of these bases and not wanting to kind of tip the hand that there's stuff there?
Well, yeah, people say, why didn't we go back to the moon after the moon landings? And that's actually a very fair question. We did the Apollo moon landings from 69 to 72, and then since then, really, it's all been about, sending space probes out to the planets, or the space shuttle program in the 80s onwards, or, just things along those lines. And so, in other words, it is a valid issue as to why we didn't go back, and why we didn't capitalize on the moon landings. But what's interesting is if you look back at what was being said by NASA and in the newspapers, sort of 69 to 72, there were these big visionary plans about, after the moon landings, we'll have other missions, where eventually we will set up some sort of outpost on the moon, which will be temporarily manned to start with, and then as we add bits to it and pieces to it, we'll hopefully have a permanent presence where, we can send astronauts up and then have them work there for a period of time and then bring them back and, change them with other astronauts, etc. And, eventually it will be completely and regularly manned by personnel. None of this happened. It was almost like we made a hop, skip, and a jump to the moon, and then that was it. And there has been speculation that, that on some of the Apollo missions, that UFOs were seen, and some people theorized the idea that perhaps we were almost warned off the surface of the moon. It was along the lines of, we realized this was essentially somebody else's property that we were intruding upon, and so it was a case of making a quick jaunt, saying we went, and then getting back before, any major problems occurred. So, I think it's a highly intriguing scenario, and it does offer, to me, a viable explanation for the big puzzle as why next year will be 40 years since we sent people to the moon. Imagine what we could have done between 72, the last moon landing, and tomorrow, next year, 2012, that's 40 years. We could have had installations on the moon. We could have launched, craft to the planets from Mars. We never did any of that, and that is kind of unusual, I think.
And we have proved out that long-term time and space is something that can happen. The cosmonauts and the astronauts have been in the space station 6 months at a time, and so even from the living ability of being in space, that's viable as well, because that was one of the questions I remember back then. Can they survive for months at a time in this isolated space capsule environment?
Well, yeah, those are important issues because, it's like when the astronauts go into space or in their Earth orbit and there's no gravity, you're floating around all the time. So in other words, you're not using your muscles. That's one of the big issues, is that, when you're in a space capsule, you're not able to put your weight down and stand up. So you're constantly, it's like floating in water. If you're doing that for 6 months, what happens is that people's muscles do degrade. And the astronauts, particularly the ones that have been up in orbit for a long, long time, for months, they come back, they get out of the capsule, they just cannot stand up, because their legs have not been used to having, to gravity. And, they just collapse, and it can take them weeks to acclimatize again to, living in a gravitational environment. So there are 2 ways around this. One is you take the most simplistic approach, is where you only send people up to the point where it's not going to be the amount of time to the way it's going to affect them. It's like a week or a few days or whatever. But, of course, that gets expensive to keep sending people back and forth. So what you do instead is you create like an artificial gravity, which to an extent can be done, where you kind of have a craft that's constantly rotating, and it kind of creates, its own gravitational environment. And on the moon, there is gravity on the moon. It's just, far less than on the Earth, so it kind of feels strange. But, getting around those issues, those are the big challenges. But, in terms of kind of recycling people over and over, somebody goes up for a week or two, that, your muscles aren't going to degrade, in 2 weeks. But when you start talking about months, that would happen. So, there is like a very good point to be made there. That is a big challenge. So.
But we have proved out that someone could go there for 6 months and do a lot of work and then come back. I mean, there would obviously be a risk in doing that.
It can be done. Yeah. It can be done. I mean, these are one of the big
challenges. But in the 70s, that was like, it was an unknown. At this point in time, it's a definitely known fact that they can survive for multiple months at a time with not overwhelming ill effects.
No, I mean, most people you can recover, but I mean, it can do, damage to your internal structure as well, when you're in a constantly gravity-free environment.
Right.
I mean, it's like, for example, you need a healthy heart, your heart beats according to the pressure on Earth, and the gravity, etc. All these have a play in terms of human blood pressure and, etc. You're in an environment where you're floating around and there's no rigors on the body, and then you go back to Earth and you're suddenly faced with gravity and pulling you down, etc. It's a shock to the body as well. Never mind just the muscles, to your organs also. But I think it's like with manned missions to Mars, etc. People are talking about missions that might take 18 months. Forget just the physical issues of being stuck in a spacecraft for 18 months with no gravity or reduced gravity. But also, there's a lot to be said about how this would affect people psychologically. I mean, can you imagine 5 astronauts sat together in a room or a capsule 15 feet by 15, 18 months each way? People could actually go crazy, I mean, joking aside, you could go crazy. If you're just stuck in a room with the same 5 people, no TV, a limited number of books, little radio conversation with, the people back home, and you could never have a real-time conversation because of the distances anyway. And, of course, what if somebody gets sick? It's not like you can turn around and go back home. What if somebody has a heart attack halfway through the mission? It's like all these issues are very critical ones that would have a bearing on, if we did embark on some of these more ambitious missions. But my point is that with the moon missions, had we continued right after 72, we probably would have ironed out a lot of these issues and problems by now. But we just chose not to, So I think that was a major mistake. Or, as I said, were we warned away? That's the other big question.
That's the other question. All right, we're going to take our last break, and then when we come back, let's talk about those censored photos, because that's almost too hard to believe that NASA would do that. I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're talking to Nick Redfern. His webpage is nickredfern.com. His book is The NASA Conspiracies, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.